When 9-year-old Lily was abandoned in a Wyoming blizzard because of her skin color, she thought she would die alone in the frozen wilderness, until a lone Comanche hunter emerged from the storm and changed everything. But when her rescuer's past collides with those who cast her out, will the bond they've forged be strong enough to survive the forces trying to tear them apart? The stagecoach wheels creaked against frozen ground as they rolled through Wyoming territory on that bitter December morning in 1867. Inside the cramped wooden box, 9-year-old Lily pressed her small face against the icy window, watching snowflakes dance like tiny white spirits in the gray sky. Her breath made little clouds that fogged the glass, and she used her finger to draw a heart before it disappeared. "How much further to Cheyenne?" asked Mrs. Whitmore, the stern woman sitting across from Lily. Her black dress was stiff with starch, and her pale hands clutched a leather bag like it held all the money in the world. "2 days if this weather holds," grunted the driver from outside. "Maybe 3 if it don't." Lily's stomach felt tight and twisted. She had been on stagecoaches before, always traveling to meet new families who might want her. But something felt different this time. Mrs. Whitmore kept looking at her with worried eyes, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't figure out. The little girl's fingers found the small cloth doll hidden in her coat pocket. It was the only thing left from her mama, who had died of fever back in Missouri. The doll's face was worn smooth from years of being held, but its button eyes still sparkled with kindness. "Tell me again about the family in Cheyenne," Lily said quietly, her voice barely louder than the wind outside. Mrs. Whitmore shifted in her seat and looked out the window instead of at Lily. "They're good people. The Hendersons. They have a big house and they're looking for a child to help with chores." But something in her voice made Lily's chest feel heavy. She had heard that same careful tone before, in Kansas City and St. Louis, when other families had sent her away after taking one look at her dark skin. The stagecoach hit a bump, and everyone bounced in their seats. Mrs. Whitmore's bag fell open, spilling papers across the floor. As Lily helped gather them up, she caught sight of a letter with fancy writing. The words were big and important looking, but she could only read a few. "No colored children. Must be white." Advertisement was clear. Mrs. Whitmore snatched the papers away quickly, her face turning pink. "Don't touch those," she snapped. Lily's heart began to pound. She had seen letters like that before. They always meant the same thing, another family that didn't want her because of how she looked. "Ma'am," she whispered, "are they really going to take me?" Mrs. Whitmore's mouth became a thin line. She stared out the window at the endless white landscape stretching in every direction. "We'll see, child. We'll see." The wind picked up, howling like a wolf around the stagecoach. Through the window, Lily could see the snow falling harder now, thick flakes that made it hard to see the road ahead. The horses snorted and shook their heads, fighting against the cold. "Storm's getting worse," called the driver. "We need to find shelter soon, or we'll all be in trouble." As if summoned by his words, a small wooden building appeared through the swirling snow. A hand-painted sign read, "Broken Creek Trading Post, Supplies and Shelter." Smoke curled from its chimney like a gray ribbon against the white sky. "Thank the Lord," Mrs. Whitmore muttered as the stagecoach lurched to a stop. But Lily felt no relief. She had learned to read the signs in grown-ups' faces, the way they looked at her when they thought she wasn't watching. And right now, Mrs. Whitmore's face told a story that made Lily's stomach feel like it was full of ice. The trading post door opened, and a man with a gray beard stepped out. He wore thick furs and heavy boots, and his eyes were kind but tired. "Welcome, travelers. I'm Ezra. Come in before you freeze to death." Inside, the trading post was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. Shelves lined the walls, holding everything from canned beans to woolen blankets. A pot bubbled over the fire, filling the air with the scent of beef stew. "How long until the storm passes?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, setting down her bag. Ezra looked out the window at the swirling snow. "Could be hours, could be days. Winter storms in Wyoming don't follow anyone's schedule." Mrs. Whitmore's face grew pale. She pulled Ezra aside, speaking in whispers that Lily could barely hear. But children who have been passed from family to family learn to listen carefully to grown-up conversations. Can't take her to Cheyenne now. They don't want her type. What am I supposed to do? Ezra's voice rose slightly. What do you mean, her type? She's just a child. Look at her, Mrs. Whitmore hissed. The family specifically said no colored children. I should have known better than to take this job. Lily felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. She clutched her doll tighter and tried to make herself smaller in the corner where she sat. The fire that had seemed so warm a moment before now felt like it was burning her cheeks with shame. Ezra glanced over at Lily, then back at Mrs. Whitmore. His voice was quiet but firm. That child has been traveling in a blizzard. She's cold and scared. Whatever problems you have with your arrangements, they can wait until she's warm and fed. He walked over to Lily and knelt down so they were eye to eye. Are you hungry, little one? Lily nodded, not trusting her voice. Well then, let's get some food in you. And maybe we can find a way to make this storm a little less frightening. But even as Ezra's kindness warmed her heart, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The storm outside was getting worse, and the storm inside Mrs. Whitmore's heart seemed ready to break loose too. The wooden spoon clattered against the bowl as Lily tried to eat the warm stew Ezra had given her. Her hands shook, not from cold anymore, but from the fear growing inside her chest like a dark flower. Mrs. Whitmore paced back and forth across the small trading post, her boots clicking against the wooden floor with each angry step. This is impossible, Mrs. Whitmore muttered, pulling out a pocket watch and checking it for the third time in 5 minutes. The Henderson family is expecting me tomorrow. They paid good money for transportation, and they specifically requested. She glanced at Lily and lowered her voice. Ezra wiped his hands on a dish towel and faced her squarely. They specifically requested what? A white child, Mrs. Whitmore said flatly, for their household staff. The girl's papers were unclear about her heritage. Her heritage? Ezra's voice carried a dangerous edge. She's a child who needs a home. What does the color of her skin matter? Mrs. Whitmore's face turned red. It matters to the people who are paying. It matters to society. It matters to everyone except bleeding hearts like you. Lily set down her spoon, no longer hungry. She had heard these arguments before in other places with other people. They always ended the same way, with her being sent somewhere else, somewhere that didn't want her either. What's going to happen to me? She asked quietly. Both adults turned to look at her, and for a moment, the trading post was silent except for the wind howling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth. Mrs. Whitmore straightened her shoulders. There are institutions back east, places for children like you. They'll teach you useful skills, give you a trade. You mean orphanages, Lily said. She wasn't stupid. She knew what institutions meant: gray walls, locked doors, and rules that felt like chains. Now see here, Ezra said, stepping between Mrs. Whitmore and Lily. This child isn't going to any institution. She can stay here until we figure out something better. Mrs. Whitmore laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. You? A single man living alone in the wilderness? The authorities would never allow it. Besides, I have a schedule to keep. Then keep it, Ezra said firmly. But leave the girl here. I can't do that. She's my responsibility until I deliver her to the proper authorities. The proper authorities? Ezra's voice rose. The proper authorities are the ones who would throw a child out into a blizzard because of her skin color? As if summoned by his words, the sound of jingling harness bells cut through the storm. Mrs. Whitmore's face lit up with relief. The stagecoach is ready to continue, she announced, grabbing her bag. Come along, child. We have a schedule to keep. No, Lily said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. I don't want to go. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flashed with anger. Children don't get to choose, especially children in your situation. She grabbed Lily's arm, but Ezra stepped forward. Let go of her. I will not be lectured by a backwoods trader about my duties, Mrs. Whitmore snapped. This child is coming with me, and that's final. The trading post door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and a blast of cold air. The stagecoach driver stomped in, shaking ice from his beard. 5 minutes, lady. Then we're moving with or without you. This storm's getting worse, and I want to reach Broken Creek Settlement before dark. Mrs. Whitmore looked at Lily, then at Ezra, then back at the driver. Fine, but I'm not taking her to Cheyenne. The settlement will have to figure out what to do with her. What settlement? Ezra asked. Broken Creek, about 2 miles north. They have a jail that can hold her until the authorities arrive. A jail? Ezra's voice was incredulous. For a 9-year-old child? For her own protection, Mrs. Whitmore said coldly. She clearly can't be trusted to stay where she's put. The driver shifted impatiently. Time's up, lady. You coming or not? Mrs. Whitmore grabbed Lily's arm again, harder this time. Get your things. We're leaving. Lily looked around desperately. The trading post had felt like safety for just a moment, but now it was slipping away like everything else in her life. Ezra's kind face was full of helpless anger. I'm sorry, little one, he whispered. I wish I could do more. You can't save everyone, mister, the driver said, not unkindly. Some battles ain't meant to be won. Mrs. Whitmore dragged Lily toward the door. The cold air hit her face like a slap, and the wind tried to steal her breath away. The stagecoach waited in the swirling snow like a hungry beast. Please, Lily whispered, but her words were lost in the storm. As they climbed into the coach, she pressed her face against the window one last time. Ezra stood in the doorway of the trading post, his silhouette outlined against the warm light inside. He raised his hand in a small wave, and Lily waved back, her heart breaking a little more. The stagecoach lurched forward, carrying her away from the first kindness she had felt in months. Outside, the storm grew stronger, and inside, Mrs. Whitmore sat rigid and silent, her duty almost complete. But Lily was already making plans. She had been pushed around and passed from place to place for too long. If they wanted to lock her in a jail cell, they would have to catch her first. The settlement of Broken Creek appeared through the snow like a cluster of dark shapes against the white landscape. As the stagecoach rolled toward what felt like a prison, Lily clutched her doll tighter and made herself a promise. She would not go quietly into whatever cage they had prepared for her. The wind howled louder, as if the storm itself was angry at what was about to happen. The jail cell door slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and Lily found herself staring through iron bars at the faces of people who had already decided her fate. Marshall Crawford jingled his keys as he hung them on a hook just out of her reach, while Reverend Hutchins smoothed his black coat and tried to look like he cared about her soul. This is for your own good, child, the Reverend said in his oily voice. Until we can arrange proper transportation back east, you'll be safe here. Safe. Lily almost laughed at the word. The cell was barely bigger than a horse stall, with a thin blanket on a wooden bench and a bucket in the corner that she didn't want to think about. The walls were made of rough stone that hurt her fingers when she touched them, and the only light came from a small window too high to reach. When will the transport come? Asked Mrs. Patterson, one of the settlement women who had come to gawk at Lily like she was some kind of strange animal in a cage. Could be weeks, Marshall Crawford said, spitting tobacco juice into a brass cup. Roads are bad this time of year, and institutions back east don't move fast for cases like hers. Cases like hers. Lily pressed her back against the cold stone wall and hugged her doll tight. She was becoming a case, a problem to be solved, instead of a little girl who just wanted someone to want her. Maybe she could work in the kitchen at the church, suggested Mrs. Patterson. Earn her keep while we wait. Absolutely not, snapped Mrs. Whitmore, who was still there making sure her job was finished. She's already shown she can't be trusted. She tried to run away from the trading post. That was a lie, but Lily had learned that grown-ups could say whatever they wanted when talking about children nobody cared about. Reverend Hutchins nodded sagely. Discipline is what she needs. Hard work and prayer to drive out the wildness. The wildness. Is that what they called wanting to be free? As the adults continued talking about her like she wasn't there, Lily studied the cell carefully. The window was too high, but there was something strange about the back wall. One of the stones seemed looser than the others, and when she pressed against it, it moved slightly. "We'll bring you supper later," Marshal Crawford said, already turning to leave. "Don't cause any trouble." The group filed out, their voices fading as they discussed her future like she was a piece of furniture to be moved around. When their footsteps disappeared completely, Lily was alone with the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. She waited until full darkness fell before starting to work on the loose stone. Her small fingers could fit into spaces that bigger hands couldn't reach, and after what felt like hours of careful wiggling, the stone came free. Behind it was another stone, also loose, and behind that was a gap just big enough for a skinny 9-year-old to squeeze through. The hole led to a narrow space between the jail and the building next to it, barely wide enough for her body but perfect for staying hidden. Lily pushed her doll through first, then wriggled after it, trying not to think about what would happen if she got stuck. The space opened into an alley behind the settlement's main street. Snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that would cover her tracks within minutes. She pulled Ezra's coat tighter around her shoulders and tried to remember which direction led away from town. But as she crept between the buildings, voices made her freeze in place. "Check the cell again," Marshal Crawford was saying. "I thought I heard something." Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow, getting closer. Lily pressed herself against the side of a building, hardly daring to breathe. Through the gap between structures, she could see lantern light dancing across the white ground. "Door's still locked," called another voice. "She's probably just scared." "Good. Let her stay scared. Might teach her some respect." The men moved on, but Lily knew she only had minutes before they discovered her escape. She had to get as far away as possible before the whole settlement turned out to hunt for her. The wind cut through her coat like knives as she stumbled away from the buildings and into the open wilderness. Behind her, she could hear shouts and see lanterns bobbing like angry fireflies in the darkness. They had found the empty cell. "She can't have gone far in this storm," Crawford's voice carried on the wind. "Spread out and search every building." Lily forced her legs to move faster, even though the snow was already up to her knees. The settlement's lights grew smaller behind her until they looked like stars that had fallen to earth. Ahead was nothing but endless white darkness and the howling of the wind. Her mother had told her stories about brave children who faced terrible dangers and found their way to safety. But those were just stories, and this was real life, where little girls froze to death in blizzards and nobody came to save them. Still, she kept walking, because even dying free was better than living in a cage. The cold was a living thing with teeth and claws that bit through every layer of clothing Lily wore. She had been walking for what felt like hours, though time had no meaning in the white void that surrounded her. The snow came down so thick she could barely see her own hands stretched out in front of her face. Each step was a battle. The drifts reached her waist in some places, forcing her to fight her way through like she was swimming in an ocean of ice. Her legs shook with exhaustion, and her breath came in short gasps that froze before they left her mouth. "One more step," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible over the screaming wind. Just one more step, but her body was failing her. The coat that had seemed so warm in the trading post now felt thin as paper. Her fingers were so numb she could barely feel her doll clutched against her chest. Worst of all, she was starting to feel warm, a dangerous warmth that meant her body was giving up the fight against the cold. Behind her, she could no longer see any lights from the settlement. The search party's voices had been swallowed by the storm long ago. She was completely alone in a wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. A sob escaped her throat before she could stop it. Her mother had always told her to be brave, but how could anyone be brave when they were lost and freezing and 9 years old? She wasn't a hero from one of those stories. She was just a scared little girl who wanted her mama. The wind shifted, and for a moment, the snow cleared enough for her to see a dark shape ahead. Hope flared in her chest like a spark. Maybe it was a cabin or a barn or anything that could provide shelter from the storm. But as she stumbled closer, her heart sank. It was just a boulder, black and lifeless against the white landscape. Still, it blocked some of the wind, so she collapsed against its base and tried to catch her breath. That's when she saw the tracks. They were almost filled with fresh snow, but she could still make out the outline of large footprints leading away from the boulder. Not the heavy boots of settlers, but something else, moccasins, maybe, or bare feet. The tracks were too big to belong to a child, but they moved with a light step that spoke of someone who knew how to travel silently through the snow. Lily looked in the direction the tracks led and saw more dark shapes in the distance. Not boulders this time, but what looked like low hills covered with some kind of material. As she watched, a thin line of smoke rose from one of the shapes and was immediately snatched away by the wind. Someone was out there. Someone who had fire and shelter. But her mother had also told her stories about the people who lived in the wilderness. Stories that made her both curious and frightened. Some were kind, her mother had said, but others were dangerous. How could she tell the difference when she was dying of cold and desperate for help? Another gust of wind nearly knocked her over, and the decision was made for her. She would rather take her chances with unknown people than freeze to death alone. Following the tracks was like following a ghost path. Whoever had made them moved so lightly that even her small weight broke through the snow more than theirs had. But the trail led steadily toward the source of that thin smoke, and that meant warmth and life. As she got closer, she could see that the dark shapes were actually tents made from animal hides, arranged in a small circle around a central fire pit. The smoke she had seen came from a carefully banked fire that glowed like a red eye in the darkness. But there was no movement around the camp. No signs of life except that precious fire. Maybe whoever lived here had gone away, leaving the fire burning. Maybe she could warm herself for a few minutes before they came back. She was almost to the edge of the camp when exhaustion finally claimed her. Her legs gave out, and she fell face first into a snowdrift that felt as soft as her mother's arms. The cold that had been her enemy suddenly felt warm and welcoming, like a blanket being pulled over her head. Just rest for a minute, she told herself. Just close your eyes for a minute, and then you'll be strong enough to keep going. But even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. Her body was shutting down, giving up the fight. The warmth spreading through her limbs wasn't real warmth. It was her life slipping away. Somewhere far above her, she thought she heard footsteps crunching through the snow. Heavy, purposeful steps that moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in this wild place. But the sound seemed to come from very far away, like an echo from another world. Mama, she thought as darkness began to close around her. I tried to be brave like you taught me. I really tried. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness took her was a pair of moccasined feet standing beside her head, and the last thing she felt was strong hands lifting her from the snow as gently as if she were made of glass. Then the cold and the fear and the loneliness all faded away, replaced by a darkness that felt like the deepest, most peaceful sleep she had ever known. Warmth touched Lily's face like gentle fingers, and slowly, she opened her eyes to find herself wrapped in the softest furs she had ever felt. Above her stretched a domed ceiling made of animal hides sewn together with careful stitches, and painted symbols danced across the walls in colors of red, blue, and yellow that seemed to glow in the firelight. A man sat cross-legged beside the fire, his back straight and his dark eyes watching her with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for important things. His skin was bronze like hers, weathered by sun and wind, and his long black hair was decorated with feathers and small bones that caught the light when he moved. Beadwork covered his buckskin shirt in patterns that told stories she couldn't read. "You are awake," he said in English that carried the rhythm of another language underneath. "Good. I was beginning to worry the cold had taken too much of your spirit." Lily tried to sit up, but her body felt weak as water. The man reached out and helped her, his hands strong but gentle. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice scratchy from the cold. "I am called Red Hawk," he replied, ladling something warm and fragrant into a wooden bowl. "And you are a child who should not be walking alone in winter storms." He handed her the bowl, and the smell that rose from it made her stomach growl loudly. It was some kind of stew with meat and roots and herbs that tasted like nothing she had ever had before, wild and rich and satisfying in a way that filled her whole body with strength. "Where am I?" she asked between careful spoonfuls. "In my winter camp, 2 days' walk from the settlement." Red Hawk stirred the fire with a long stick, sending sparks dancing upward. You were nearly frozen when I found you. Another hour, and you would have joined your ancestors. The word ancestors made Lily think of her mother, and suddenly tears were rolling down her cheeks. She had been so focused on staying alive that she hadn't had time to really think about how alone she was in the world. Red Hawk watched her cry without trying to stop her, the way adults usually did. When her tears finally slowed, he spoke again. Why does a child walk alone in a blizzard? Where is your family? I don't have a family, Lily said, wiping her nose on her sleeve. Nobody wants me because of how I look. Red Hawk's eyebrows drew together. How you look? My skin, she said quietly. It's too dark for white people and not dark enough for other people. I don't fit anywhere. For a long moment, Red Hawk was silent. Then he held out his hand, palm up, next to hers. His skin was darker than hers, weathered and scarred from years of living in the wilderness. The earth is many colors, he said finally. Brown soil, red clay, black rock, yellow sand. All are necessary. All are beautiful. Only foolish people think one color is better than another. Something warm spread through Lily's chest that had nothing to do with the fire or the food. It was the first time anyone had ever told her that her skin color was beautiful instead of wrong. But why did you help me? She asked. You don't even know me. Red Hawk was quiet for so long that Lily wondered if he had forgotten the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. I had a daughter once. She would be your age now, if the fever had not taken her. He reached into a leather bag beside him and pulled out something wrapped in soft buckskin. Her name was Little Fox, and she had eyes that sparkled like yours when she laughed. Inside the buckskin was a small silver locket on a delicate chain, clearly made by white craftsmen but worn smooth by loving hands. Where did this come from? Lily asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. A wagon train was attacked by soldiers 3 winters ago. My people were blamed, but we found only bodies and burned wagons when we arrived. Red Hawk's jaw tightened. Among the dead was a woman with skin like yours, and a small girl who could have been your sister. This locket was around the woman's neck. Lily's breath caught in her throat. What happened to the little girl? She was already with the spirits when we found her. But before she died, I promised her I would keep this safe until I found someone who needed it more than the dead. He fastened the locket around Lily's neck, his movements as careful as if he were handling something sacred. You think I need it? She asked, touching the warm silver. I think you need to remember that you are not alone in this world. Others have walked the path you walk. Others have survived. Outside the tent, the wind had died down, and Lily could hear the soft sounds of night settling over the camp. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and she thought she heard the howl of a wolf, far away but not threatening. What will happen to me now? She asked. Red Hawk added another piece of wood to the fire. That depends on many things. The storm will pass soon, and people will be looking for you. I don't want to go back to that jail, Lily said quickly. I'd rather freeze in the snow than be locked up again. Then we will make sure that does not happen, Red Hawk said simply, as if saving runaway children was something he did every day. But even as warmth and safety surrounded her for the first time in months, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that this peace wouldn't last. Somewhere out there, people were already making plans that didn't include asking her what she wanted. For now, though, she was warm and fed and sitting next to someone who thought her skin was beautiful instead of wrong. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she was dying in the snow. Red Hawk began to hum softly, a melody that seemed to come from the earth itself, and Lily let her eyes drift closed, feeling safer than she had since her mother died. The morning sun painted the inside of the tent golden as Lily woke to the smell of cooking meat and the sound of Red Hawk moving quietly around the fire. Her body felt stronger than it had in days, though her muscles ached from her fight through the blizzard. The silver locket lay warm against her chest, and she touched it gently, still amazed that someone had given her something so precious. Come, Red Hawk said when he saw her stirring. Today you learn why the Comanche are called the finest horsemen on the plains. Outside the tent, the world had been transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white that sparkled like diamonds in the morning light. The air was so clear and cold it made her lungs tingle, and the sky stretched endless and blue above the snow-covered plains. But what took her breath away was the horse. It stood near the edge of camp, a beautiful painted mare with brown and white patches that looked like someone had spilled paint across her coat. The horse's breath steamed in the cold air, and her dark eyes watched Lily with intelligent curiosity. "This is Wind Dancer," Red Hawk said, approaching the mare with slow, respectful movements. "She has carried me safely for 6 winters, and she knows the land better than any map." "She's beautiful," Lily whispered, afraid to speak too loudly and startle the animal. "Beauty is not her greatest gift," Red Hawk replied, running his hand along the horse's neck. "Her greatest gift is wisdom. She knows when danger approaches before human eyes can see it." As if to prove his point, Wind Dancer suddenly lifted her head, ears pricked forward, staring toward the eastern horizon. Red Hawk followed her gaze, his body going very still. "What is it?" Lily asked. "Riders," Red Hawk said grimly. "Many riders, moving fast." Lily squinted into the distance but could see nothing except endless white plains. But Wind Dancer's behavior left no doubt that something was coming. "Is it the people from the settlement?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the tension in Red Hawk's shoulders. "Most likely. They will have tracked us here." He moved quickly to the tent and began gathering supplies. "We must leave. Now. But where can we go? They'll just follow us again." Red Hawk paused in his packing and looked at her seriously. "There is a place in the mountains where my people once made their winter camps. Hidden valleys that white men have never seen. But the journey is dangerous, especially for a child." "More dangerous than going back to that jail?" Lily asked. A grim smile crossed Red Hawk's face. "You learn quickly, little one." Within minutes, he had the tent taken down and their supplies packed on Wind Dancer's back. The horse stood perfectly still as he worked, as if she understood the urgency of their situation. "Can you ride?" Red Hawk asked. "I've never been on a horse before," Lily admitted. "Then today you learn many new things." He helped her climb onto Wind Dancer's back, then swung up behind her with the fluid grace of someone who had been born in the saddle. His arms came around her as he took the reins, and she felt as secure as if she were wrapped in her mother's embrace. "Hold tight," he said. "Wind Dancer runs like her name suggests." The horse leaped forward, and Lily's world became a blur of white snow and cold wind. But instead of the jarring, uncomfortable motion she had expected, riding Wind Dancer was like flying. The mare's hooves seemed to barely touch the ground as she carried them across the plains with a smooth, rocking gait that felt almost like floating. Behind them, Lily could now see the dark shapes of the riders Red Hawk had sensed. Even at this distance, she could make out the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers and the black coat of Marshal Crawford. "How did they find us so fast?" she called over the wind. "They know the land almost as well as I do," Red Hawk replied. "And they have many horses to our one." But as they rode, Lily began to understand that the chase was about more than just bringing back a runaway child. The soldiers rode with the grim determination of men who saw Red Hawk as an enemy, not just a man who had helped a freezing girl. "They want to hurt you because of me," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "They want to hurt me because I am Comanche," Red Hawk corrected. "You are just their excuse." Wind Dancer carried them across frozen streams and up snow-covered hills, her sure feet finding paths that seemed invisible to human eyes. But the soldiers had fresher horses and more of them, and slowly, steadily, they were gaining ground. "There," Red Hawk said, pointing toward a line of rocky cliffs rising from the plains like the backbone of some enormous buried beast. "The entrance to the hidden valley is in those rocks. If we can reach it before they catch us." But even as he spoke, Lily could see that the math was wrong. The soldiers would catch them long before they reached the safety of the cliffs. Wind Dancer seemed to sense it too. Her ears flattened against her head, and she stretched her legs even further, running now with desperate speed. But horses, even the finest horses, could not run forever. "Red Hawk," Lily said quietly. "What happens if they catch us?" His arms tightened around her slightly. "They will take you back to the settlement. And they will take me to a place where Comanche warriors are not allowed to leave." Prison, she realized. Or worse. The sound of pursuing hoofbeats was getting closer now, loud enough to hear over Wind Dancer's labored breathing. The beautiful mare was giving everything she had, but it might not be enough. Ahead, the cliffs loomed larger and more detailed, close enough now that Lily could see individual rocks and patches of ice. But behind them, she could also see the faces of the soldiers, their expressions grim with the certainty of capture. The race was almost over, and Lily wasn't sure who was going to win. The crack of rifle fire split the morning air like thunder, and a bullet whistled past Lily's ear so close she felt the wind of its passing. Wind Dancer stumbled slightly but kept running, her powerful legs eating up the ground between them and the rocky cliffs that promised safety, if they could reach them alive. "Stay low," Red Hawk commanded, pressing Lily down against the horse's neck as another shot rang out behind them. Marshal Crawford's voice boomed across the snow. "Stop running, Indian. You're only making this harder on yourself and the girl." But Red Hawk urged Wind Dancer forward, and Lily could feel the mare's heart pounding beneath her like a war drum. The horse was tiring, foam flecked her neck, and her breathing came in harsh gasps, but she never slowed her desperate pace toward the cliffs. The rock walls rose before them like a fortress, dark stones streaked with ice and snow. At first, Lily couldn't see any opening at all, just solid walls stretching up toward the sky. But as they got closer, Red Hawk guided Wind Dancer toward what looked like a shadow between two massive boulders. "There," he said, his voice tight with strain, "the hidden entrance. But we must dismount and lead her through. The passage is too narrow for riding." They slid from Wind Dancer's back just as the soldiers crested the hill behind them. Lily could see their faces now, angry, determined men who viewed Red Hawk as a dangerous savage and her as stolen property to be returned. "Halt!" shouted a sergeant with silver stripes on his sleeve. "By order of the United States Army." Instead of halting, Red Hawk grabbed Wind Dancer's reins and pulled her toward the narrow gap in the rocks. Lily ran beside them, her legs shaking from the wild ride but carrying her forward on pure determination. The opening was barely wide enough for the horse, and the walls pressed close on both sides as they squeezed through. Behind them, she could hear the soldiers dismounting, their boots crunching in the snow as they gave chase on foot. "They're following us," Lily gasped. "The passage narrows ahead," Red Hawk replied. "They will have to come single file, and some of them will not fit at all." But as they pushed deeper into the rocky corridor, Lily heard something that made her blood run cold, the voice of Reverend Hutchins echoing off the stone walls. "Child, this is madness. Come back before you get hurt." "Why is he here?" she asked Red Hawk. "Politicians and soldiers work together," Red Hawk said grimly. "They want to make sure this looks legal and proper when they take you away." The passage opened suddenly into a small clearing surrounded by towering cliffs on all sides. A thin waterfall cascaded down one wall, frozen now into sheets of blue ice, and patches of hardy grass poked through the snow where underground springs kept the ground from freezing completely. "This is it," Red Hawk said, looking around the hidden valley with satisfaction. "They cannot bring horses here, and there is only one way in or out." But even as he spoke, the first soldier squeezed through the narrow passage, his rifle ready and his face flushed with anger and exertion. "End of the line," Marshal Crawford panted as he pushed through behind the soldier. Nowhere left to run. More men followed, 6 soldiers in blue uniforms, Reverend Hutchins looking uncomfortable in his black coat, and finally a thin man in a bowler hat that Lily didn't recognize. "Who's that?" she whispered to Red Hawk. "Government man," he replied quietly. "Come to make sure everything is done by the book." The man in the bowler hat stepped forward, pulling out an official-looking paper. "I am Agent Morrison from the Bureau of Indian Affairs," he announced in a nasal voice. "Red Hawk of the Comanche people, you are under arrest for kidnapping a minor child and resisting lawful authority." "I saved her life," Red Hawk said simply. She was dying in the snow. That's not how the law sees it, Agent Morrison replied. The child was in legal custody, being transported to proper authorities. Your interference constitutes a federal crime. Lily felt anger burning in her chest like a coal from the fire. Nobody asked me what I wanted. You were going to lock me in a jail cell. Children don't get to choose their fate, Marshall Crawford said harshly. Especially children with no family and no money. But that's not exactly true, is it? Agent Morrison said, consulting his papers again. According to these documents, young Lily Morrison is not the penniless orphan we were led to believe. A shocked silence fell over the clearing. Even Red Hawk looked surprised, his dark eyes fixed on the government agent with sudden intensity. What do you mean? Reverend Hutchins asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Agent Morrison smiled. Not a kind smile, but the smile of a man who enjoyed having information other people wanted. It seems our little runaway has been hiding quite a secret. Or rather, the adults responsible for her have been hiding it. He pulled out another paper, this one older and more yellowed than the first. This is the last will and testament of one Jeremiah Morrison, deceased, formerly of the California goldfields. It names his granddaughter, one Lily Morrison, as sole heir to a considerable fortune. The words hit Lily like a physical blow. Grandfather? Fortune? She had never heard of any Jeremiah Morrison, and certainly had never known she had family with money. That's impossible. Mrs. Whitmore's voice came from the passage entrance as she squeezed through, her dress torn and her face red from the cold pursuit. I checked all her papers thoroughly. There was no mention of any inheritance. That's because someone went to considerable trouble to make sure those papers disappeared, Agent Morrison said, his pale eyes fixed on Mrs. Whitmore with obvious suspicion. Papers that would have made this child very valuable indeed, to the right people. How much money? Marshall Crawford asked, and Lily could see the greed already calculating behind his eyes. Enough to make certain people very interested in becoming her legal guardian, Agent Morrison replied. Enough to make others very interested in making sure she never learned about it. Red Hawk moved slightly, placing himself between Lily and the circle of adults whose expressions had changed from dismissive to intensely interested. She was no longer just a troublesome child to be disposed of. She was suddenly a valuable prize to be claimed. This changes everything, Reverend Hutchins said, his oily voice taking on a note of false concern. The child will need proper protection, proper guidance in managing such responsibility. The child will need people who actually care about her welfare, Red Hawk said quietly, but his words carried the weight of a challenge. And you think that's you, Savage? Marshall Crawford snarled, raising his rifle slightly. I think that's not you, Red Hawk replied, his hand moving casually to the knife at his belt. The tension in the clearing grew thick as winter ice, and Lily realized that her life had just become much more complicated and much more dangerous. Lower your weapons, Agent Morrison commanded sharply as Marshall Crawford's rifle swung toward Red Hawk. This is a legal matter now, not a military one. But the damage was already done. The circle of adults around Lily had transformed from captors into competitors, each one calculating how they might benefit from her newfound wealth. She could see it in their eyes, the same greedy look she had seen in the faces of people who had promised to help her before. The inheritance will require proper legal guardianship, Reverend Hutchins said smoothly, stepping closer to Lily. As a man of God and a pillar of the community, I would be honored to guide this child through such worldly matters. Like hell, Marshall Crawford snorted. Legal guardianship goes to the nearest qualified relative or appointed official. That would be me, as the duly elected law enforcement representative of this territory. Mrs. Whitmore straightened her torn dress and lifted her chin. I am the child's appointed escort and have been legally responsible for her transport. Any guardianship arrangement should recognize my existing authority. Agent Morrison watched this display with obvious amusement. Fascinating how quickly everyone's concern for the child's welfare has intensified. Red Hawk said nothing, but Lily could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. His hand remained near his knife, and his eyes never left the soldier's weapons. "What about what I want?" Lily asked, her voice small but carrying clearly in the cold air. "Children with inheritances don't get to want things," Agent Morrison said matter-of-factly. "They get trustees and guardians and legal representatives. People who understand money better than they do." "People who understand stealing better than they do, you mean?" Red Hawk said quietly. Marshal Crawford's face flushed red. "Watch your mouth, Indian, or you'll find yourself with more problems than kidnapping charges." "Gentlemen, please," Reverend Hutchins interjected. "This is not about personal gain. This is about ensuring that a child receives proper Christian guidance in managing the worldly burden that has been placed upon her." "Worldly burden?" Lily repeated. "You mean my grandfather's money?" "Money can be a terrible temptation for the young and inexperienced," the Reverend explained in his most patronizing voice. "It requires mature, godly supervision to ensure it is used properly." Lily looked around the circle of adults, each one wearing an expression of false concern that barely concealed their true motives. Then she looked at Red Hawk, who had asked for nothing from her except the chance to save her life. "I don't want guardians or trustees," she said clearly. "I want to stay with Red Hawk." A chorus of protests erupted from the adults. "Impossible," Reverend Hutchins sputtered. "Illegal," added Agent Morrison. "Insane," declared Mrs. Whitmore. But Marshal Crawford's response was the most telling. "Over my dead body will a white child be raised by a savage," he snarled, raising his rifle again. "I don't care how much money she's got." "Careful, Marshal," Agent Morrison warned. "That money makes her a federal concern now. Any harm that comes to her will bring investigators from Washington." "Then we take her back to town and sort this out properly," Crawford said. "But the Indian doesn't leave this valley alive. He's seen too much, knows too much." Red Hawk's knife appeared in his hand so quickly that Lily barely saw him draw it. "I have broken no laws except the law that says a child should freeze to death rather than be helped by the wrong color of person." "You kidnapped her," Mrs. Whitmore shrieked. "I found her dying in the snow because you threw her away like garbage," Red Hawk replied, his voice deadly calm. "Now that you discover she has value, suddenly you all care about her welfare." The truth of his words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Every adult in the clearing knew he was right, but none of them would admit it. "The law is the law," Agent Morrison said finally. "The child returns to proper authorities for processing of her inheritance claim. The Indian faces charges for interference with legal custody." "What if the child's grandfather's will specifies different arrangements?" Red Hawk asked suddenly. Agent Morrison frowned. "What do you mean?" "Legal documents sometimes contain specific instructions about guardianship. Do they not? Perhaps someone should read the actual will before making assumptions about who has authority." The government agent's pale face went even paler. "The will is... that is, the specific provisions are... You haven't actually read it, have you?" Red Hawk pressed. "You know about the money, but you don't know what conditions the old man attached to it." The silence that followed was answer enough. Agent Morrison had heard about the inheritance through official channels, but he hadn't bothered to examine the actual legal document. "I demand to see that will," Lily said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "If it's about my money, then I have a right to know what my grandfather actually said." "Children don't have legal rights to examine inheritance documents," Agent Morrison replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Children with federal inheritance claims do," Red Hawk said, "especially when their appointed guardians may have conflicts of interest." Marshal Crawford was getting more agitated by the minute. "This is all legal nonsense. The Indian is still under arrest, and the girl is still coming back with us." But Agent Morrison was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Perhaps we should return to town and conduct a proper review of all documentation before proceeding." "Scared the will might say something you don't want to hear?" Red Hawk asked. The government agent's silence was answer enough. Lily felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, her grandfather had been smarter than the people trying to steal from her now. Maybe he had found a way to protect her even after his death. "We're going back to town," Marshal Crawford announced. "All of us. And if the Indian tries anything, he'll answer to my rifle." But as they prepared to leave the hidden valley, Lily noticed that Red Hawk didn't look worried anymore. In fact, he looked almost satisfied. What did he know that the others didn't? The telegram that arrived at Broken Creek Settlement that afternoon changed everything, and Agent Morrison's hands shook as he read it aloud in the cramped office behind the general store. "From San Francisco Federal Court," he announced, his voice cracking slightly. "Urgent stop will of Jeremiah Morrison contains specific guardianship provisions. Stop legal review required before any custody decisions. Stop federal marshal on route stop." Lily sat in a hard wooden chair, still wearing Red Hawk's coat and clutching her cloth doll, watching the adults argue over her future like she was a piece of property at an auction. But something had changed in the last hour. She could see fear creeping into their eyes, the same fear she had lived with every day of her life. "This is ridiculous," Marshal Crawford fumed, pacing back and forth in the small space. "A child is a child, inheritance or no inheritance. She belongs with proper Christian folks, not with some savage in the wilderness. The law doesn't care about your opinions, Marshal," Agent Morrison replied, mopping sweat from his forehead despite the cold air seeping through the walls. "If the will specifies particular guardianship arrangements, those provisions supersede local authority." Red Hawk stood near the window, his wrists bound with rope but his bearing still proud and dignified. Every few minutes, his eyes would meet Lily's, and she would see something there that the adults missed. A quiet confidence that made her think he knew something important that he wasn't sharing yet. What kind of provisions could an old prospector possibly make? Reverend Hutchins asked, wringing his hands nervously. Surely nothing that would override common sense and Christian duty. "Rich men make all kinds of unusual provisions," Agent Morrison muttered. "Especially men who've lived through the kind of prejudice that drives people to the goldfields in the first place." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Lily felt her heart begin to beat faster. Could her grandfather have been like her? Could he have known what it felt like to be unwanted because of the color of his skin? Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat loudly. "Whatever the will says, we need to consider the child's immediate welfare. She's been through a terrible ordeal, kidnapped by a dangerous savage, forced to live in primitive conditions." "I wasn't kidnapped," Lily said firmly, her voice cutting through the adult conversation like a knife. "Red Hawk saved my life when all of you were ready to let me freeze to death. Children don't understand the complexities of these situations," Mrs. Whitmore replied in her most condescending tone. "I understand that you threw me away like garbage when you found out the family in Cheyenne didn't want me," Lily shot back. "I understand that you locked me in a jail cell like I was a criminal. And I understand that none of you cared if I lived or died until someone told you I had money." The room fell silent except for the wind rattling the windows. Even Marshal Crawford stopped pacing, his face flushing red with embarrassment or anger. Agent Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The child has a point. The circumstances of her relocation will certainly be reviewed as part of the federal investigation." "Investigation?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose to a squeak. "Child abandonment is a serious crime," the agent replied, "especially when it involves potential heirs to federal inheritance cases." The door burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. Ezra from the trading post stumbled in, his face red from riding hard through the cold. "They're coming," he gasped, leaning against the doorframe to catch his breath. 3 riders moving fast from the east, one of them wearing a federal badge that caught the sun from 2 miles away. Agent Morrison went pale. "Already? But the telegram just arrived." "Maybe they were already on their way," Red Hawk said quietly from his position by the window. It was the first time he had spoken since they arrived in town, and everyone turned to look at him. "What do you know about this?" Marshal Crawford demanded. Red Hawk's dark eyes held secrets. "I know that wise men prepare for winter storms before the first snow falls." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the sound of horses reached them through the walls. Heavy hoofbeats moving with military precision, slowing as they approached the settlement. Federal Marshal Thompson. A strong voice called from outside. Open up in there. Agent Morrison straightened his tie nervously and opened the door. A tall man in a long coat stepped inside, followed by two deputies who looked like they meant business. The marshal's badge was indeed bright enough to catch sunlight, and his weathered face suggested he had seen everything the frontier could throw at him. Gentlemen, ma'am, he said, nodding to the assembled group. I'm here about the Morrison inheritance case and the allegations of child endangerment. Marshal Thompson, Agent Morrison said with obvious relief. Thank goodness you're here. We have a rather complex situation. I'm sure you do, the federal marshal replied dryly. But first things first. Where's the child? All eyes turned to Lily, who felt suddenly shy under the gaze of this imposing man. But Marshal Thompson's expression softened when he looked at her, and his voice became gentler. Hello there, Miss Morrison. I'm Marshal Thompson. I've come a long way to make sure you're safe and that your grandfather's wishes are properly respected. You know about my grandfather? Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew Jeremiah Morrison personally, the marshal replied. Fine man, smart man, and a man who loved his granddaughter very much, even though he never got to meet her. Lily's eyes filled with tears. He knew about me? He spent the last 5 years of his life trying to find you, Marshal Thompson said gently. When he died, he left very specific instructions about what should happen if you were ever located. Agent Morrison stepped forward eagerly. About the guardianship provisions. All in good time, the federal marshal said firmly. First, I need to understand exactly how this child ended up abandoned in a blizzard, and why a Comanche hunter is standing there in chains for saving her life. The room erupted in voices as everyone tried to explain their version of events at once. But Marshal Thompson held up his hand for silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. One at a time, he said, and I suggest everyone tell the truth, because I already know more about this situation than you might think. Red Hawk's eyes met Lily's again, and this time she was sure she saw him smile slightly. Whatever was about to happen, he had been expecting it. The last rays of sunlight painted the settlement golden as Marshal Thompson spread the yellowed papers of Jeremiah Morrison's will across the general store counter. Each page weighted down with smooth river stones to keep them flat. The adults crowded around like vultures, but Lily noticed that Red Hawk had somehow positioned himself where he could see everything despite his bound hands. Before I read the specific provisions, Marshal Thompson announced, I think everyone should understand who Jeremiah Morrison really was. He looked directly at Lily, his weathered face kind but serious. Your grandfather was born a slave in Georgia, child. He escaped to California during the gold rush and made his fortune through hard work, smart investments, and the kind of determination that runs in your family. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Mrs. Whitmore actually gasped and took a step backward, while Marshal Crawford's face went through several shades of red and purple. That's impossible, Reverend Hutchins sputtered. The child is clearly of mixed heritage, but to suggest that such wealth could come from what? Marshal Thompson's voice carried a dangerous edge. From a man whose skin was the wrong color? From someone who pulled himself up from nothing and built an empire worth more than this entire territory. Agent Morrison had gone very quiet, his pale face now the color of old parchment. How much are we talking about? He asked weakly. Enough to buy and sell everyone in this room 10 times over, the marshal replied. Enough to make young Lily one of the wealthiest people west of the Mississippi. But Lily barely heard the number he mentioned. She was still thinking about her grandfather, a man who had been a slave, who had fought for his freedom, who had never given up hope of finding her. Did he really look for me? She asked softly. Marshal Thompson's expression gentled. He hired private detectives, placed advertisements in newspapers across the country, even sent agents to orphanages and institutions. He never stopped believing he would find you. Then why didn't he? The marshal's eyes flicked briefly to Mrs. Whitmore, who was now studying her shoes with intense interest. Because some people made sure his letters and inquiries never reached the right places. Some people thought a colored child was better off forgotten, even if it meant stealing her inheritance. "Now see here," Mrs. Whitmore began, but Marshall Thompson cut her off with a look that could have frozen water. "I'll deal with you later, ma'am. Right now, I'm more interested in what Jeremiah Morrison wanted for his granddaughter." He lifted the first page of the will and began to read in a clear, strong voice. "Being of sound mind and body, and knowing the hardships that await a child of mixed heritage in this world, I hereby establish the following provisions for my beloved granddaughter, Lily Morrison, should she be found." The legal language was complicated, but the meaning became clear as the marshal continued reading. Jeremiah Morrison had anticipated exactly what had happened to Lily. He had seen the prejudice, the abandonment, the way society would try to dispose of her, and he had planned for all of it. "The child shall have complete control over her inheritance upon reaching the age of 16, Marshall Thompson read, "or upon demonstrating sufficient maturity to handle such responsibility as determined by a court of law." 16. Agent Morrison squeaked. "But that's unheard of. Children don't control large inheritances." "This child does," the marshal replied firmly. "Furthermore, any person or institution found to have abandoned, mistreated, or attempted to defraud the aforementioned Lily Morrison shall be permanently barred from any involvement in her affairs, and shall face prosecution under federal law." Every adult in the room except Red Hawk suddenly looked very uncomfortable. But Marshall Thompson wasn't finished. "And finally," he continued, "recognizing that my granddaughter may find herself in need of protection from those who would exploit her for their own gain, I hereby establish that she may choose her own guardian from among those who have demonstrated genuine care for her welfare, regardless of their race, religion, or social standing." The room exploded into protests and arguments, but Lily heard none of it. Her grandfather had given her something she had never had before, the power to choose her own life. She looked at Red Hawk, who was watching her with quiet pride, as if he had known all along that this moment would come. Then she looked at the circle of adults who had seen her as worthless until they learned about her money. "I choose Red Hawk," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a bell. "That's impossible," Reverend Hutchins declared. "That's illegal," added Agent Morrison. "That's final," said Marshall Thompson, folding up the will with satisfaction. "The child has made her choice according to the legal provisions established by her grandfather. Red Hawk of the Comanche people is hereby appointed as legal guardian of Lily Morrison and administrator of her inheritance until she reaches the age of majority." Marshal Crawford's hand moved toward his gun, but the federal marshal's deputies were faster, their own weapons appearing like magic. "I wouldn't," Marshal Thompson advised calmly. "Federal judges take a dim view of people who threaten legal guardians, especially guardians chosen by wealthy orphans." As the marshal cut Red Hawk's bonds with his knife, Lily felt something she had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "What happens now?" she asked. Red Hawk rubbed his wrists where the ropes had been and smiled at her with genuine warmth. "Now we go home, little one. We go home." Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, Wind Dancer nickered softly, as if she knew their long journey was finally over. Lily touched the silver locket at her throat and thought about her grandfather, a man she had never met but who had loved her enough to move mountains. Then she took Red Hawk's hand and walked with him toward whatever tomorrow would bring. No longer an unwanted child, but a young woman with the power to shape her own destiny. The wind that had once carried her cries of despair now sang with the promise of freedom, and for the first time in her life, Lily Morrison knew she was truly home.